Excellencies, esteemed guests, good morning. We are delighted to welcome you to Hili Forum. I am Abed Zaabi, the Sector Director for Strategic Studies and Research at the ECSSR. In today's discussion, titled MAGA or Woke, World Politics in 2025, we aim to tackle some of the potential global implications of the upcoming US elections. We find ourselves at a critical juncture in world politics. The outcome of this election between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris will undoubtedly influence not only the direction of US domestic policy, but also reshape the geopolitical landscape and on a global scale. And before we start our discussion, let me first introduce our speakers for this session. We are honored to have the Honourable Clarke Cooper, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs and former U.S. alternate representative to the United Nations Security Council from the United States. Also, we are also joining us Dr. Samir Saran, President of Observer Research Foundation, ORF, from India. And we also have Professor Mehran Kamrava, Professor of Government at Georgetown University in Qatar. Before I move to our speakers, the format of our conversation will be as, at the beginning, I will pose some question of my own, and then we'll open the floor for the audience and participants through the online link, as we mentioned at the beginning, which for the audience, you can scan the code and pose your questions. Mr. Cooper, yes, let me start with you. There are several issues where the positions of former President Trump's administration and the current Biden-Harris administrations differ, one of which is the U.S. defense contribution, whether financially or through equipment, to multilateral organizations such as the NATO. We have Harris, who adopts a more cooperative and open approach toward multilateral alliances, and Trump, who has consistently signaled a reduction in U.S. support and contributions to NATO, or even withdrawal. Thus, in the event of a Trump victory, could we indeed witness a U.S. retreat from such alliances like NATO, for instance? Or could current international conditions such as the Ukraine-Russian war or the conflict in Gaza hinder Trump from following that approach?
Thank you. So to the first question regarding multilateral bodies, and specifically you mentioned commitments like NATO, it's worth noting probably a very, I would say, boring technocratic aspect about American treaty commitments is they are not dependent on any president, whoever he or she may be. Our treaty commitments are ratified through our Senate process, which is extremely important when one's looking at it from a member state perspective. This was a conversation I actually just had with His Excellency former Prime Minister Bildt after the plenary session, since Sweden is the newest member of NATO, which we are happy to see from an alliance perspective. On the commitments that were asked, yes, that's reference to 10 years ago, 2014, the Wales Agreement amongst NATO member states on meeting at least a 2% of GDP on defense spending. That is something every American president since 2014, including President Obama, when that commitment was made, following President Trump and President Biden. And regardless of who the next president is in 2025, there'll still be that push for member states to meet that agreement. Now, where's the difference? The difference has certainly been in the tone and the tenor of that. The Trump administration to be fair, was probably louder, maybe more clear, someone may say, maybe a little bit more blunt about member states meeting their commitment on NATO. But at the base core of it, what the Trump administration was pushing on NATO commitments doesn't differ from his predecessor, President Obama, or his successor, President Biden. On a broader sense, the question asked about a risk on multilateral bodies writ large. Again, I go back to how treaties are promulgated in the United States. So for the U.S. to be a member of the United Nations and for the U.S. to be a member of NATO, for example, again, that is not determinant by the executive power solely. It can influence how the U.S. Addresses economic and security imperatives in those bodies, but our membership is requisite on treaty commitments, and that is the legislative branch, again, the Senate having that control of us either remaining or leaving. But this is not an easy proposition, and I would just say from a technocratic sense, any talk about posture shift is going to be more about tone and tenor and how performance is done. It's not going to be if we're in or if we're not in it.
So this is, you talked like more about like staying or leaving. How about contributing?
Yeah, so we just talked about NATO contributions. I would say an issue that's transcended administrations in the past, and when I was serving on the Security Council for the United States, is getting members to pay dues as well. Again, a similar issue where the United States has either been louder or less loud, depending on who the president is, about members paying their dues at the UN and members meeting either, say, commitments with NATO. That is probably something that you would see maybe a difference in. Historically, if one looks at across administrations, because we don't have a multi-party system in the United States, it's very easy for one to kind of get a picture that if there's a Republican president, there's a little bit more effort and focus on performance measures. When it comes to peacekeeping mandates, there's a little bit more effort and focus on mandate review coming out of the UN. Democrat side, again, historically maybe more acquiescent to a continuance of mandates versus, say, mandate review, or seeing if there should be a cancellation of a particular mandate. But where it's the same is there's an expectation on member states contributing. And so you're going to see either a muscle flex of getting contributions, or you're going to see more maybe acquiescence, but presence is going to be there. And you can see this by the permanent representatives that have been put in place in the past over administrations. Are they a voice of interests that are crossing regional concerns, some shared by the UAE? Are they voices to make sure that performance measures are met? And this is not an issue that's just solely from the U.S. perspective. Other member states are concerned about performance measures on mandates. And I keep mentioning peacekeeping because this is an area of reform that has been of interest in Republican administrations. So I would anticipate that being coming up again if there was a Republican president. That said, I'm not saying Democrats aren't interested in it either. It's just that, again, historic precedents of how things are addressed at the UN. But I do want to put to rest any of the concerns of leaving these multilateral bodies. That is not the case. Again, no president on their own could take such a direction.
Thank you. We have heard like many times that Donald Trump said that whenever he came to office, he can end the Ukraine war like within 24 hours. So saying that are we expecting like a de-escalation if Trump to be in office, or an escalation regarding the Ukraine war?
So one thing that I would put that's interesting when you look at what has been said recently from former President Trump and current Vice President Harris, I'm gonna combine this as unusual as this may be. I'm going to combine Ukraine and Gaza because they're the two top kinetic areas of focus for all capitals essentially. Right now, it's taking up most of the attention. Both of the candidates have said they want to seek an end to the conflict, and interestingly enough, they have caveated the need to seek the end of the conflict based on humanitarian concerns. That has actually been a constant from Trump and Harris. Now, they say it a little differently, but they actually predicate their need for immediate cessation of conflict based on humanitarian concerns. And they're both on record that they would end these wars as president. So they both have said, if I'm president, I will get the grand halas. That's a lot to be said in a political cycle for any candidate, but they both have said that they would do that. What neither of them have said, and this is what I wanted to tease out here, I found it fascinating from an analytical standpoint that neither former President Trump nor current Vice President Harris has said anything as to how these wars would be won and how the interests of the parties in those wars would be addressed. That is significant when we talk about those of us who are here when we're looking at opportunities and solutions. So my critique about the both candidates is while they are concerned about the humanitarian issues and while they want to actually bring it into the wars, they've not said anything about how they would bring it into them or how there would be reconciliation at the end. So there's not been any serious talk about what does post-conflict Gaza reconstruction mean? What does post-conflict, post-war reconstruction mean in Ukraine? They both seem to believe there's a U.S. interest in stopping the wars, but they've not really expressed or spelled out either about how an American partner and ally can achieve their war objectives. So that has not been there. So it's fascinating and frustrating as an American to see where, in many ways, they're quite similar, and yet there's not been an articulated pathway toward how this is completed or done.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Dr. Saran, yes. Can you please tell us or give us an overview to what extent will international dynamics and challenges constrain Harris and Trump as they pursue their foreign policy agendas?
No, I was listening to the previous speaker and I was struck by the fact that there's a broad trend in the US today where both parties, without explicitly stating so, have signed on to that particular trend. The first trend is nationalist economic policies or industrial policies. I remember a time when the Americans and Europeans used to come down to New Delhi and different capitals of the global south and argue against industrial policies, seeking open borders and global manufacturing linkages, and now it's called global value chains. But that was the sales pitch for many, many years. Today, whether it is Make America Great Again of Trump or the Inflation Reduction Act of Biden, these are very clear American industrial policies designed to bring manufacturing back home, to create jobs in America, to reclaim the spaces for economic spaces that had, in some of their minds, had been ceded to other countries around the world. So I think the first commonality between both candidates is the industrial policy approach. And they can speak different grammar, but the intention I find quite similar. The second agreement that they've signed on to, which again they haven't explicitly stated, is the China policy. Now, the single biggest global challenge to America in terms of the American way of conducting international relations, economic relations, comes from Beijing. And both candidates and both parties over the last 10 years have shown a remarkable similarity in their assessment of the China threat and in progressively moving towards a far more, what I would say, palpable American anxious response to China's growing presence, right? So again, the China policy seems to be very similar when you look at both these countries. Both are completely lost on what to do in Ukraine, and I think that's the question you asked, because there are other actors involved. I think the Americans would have heaved a sigh of relief if the Russians had won the war in 7 days, right? It would not have required any great geopolitical maneuvering. The problem now is that you have a country that refuses to get defeated, Ukraine. It's fighting and valiantly, and you have a superpower that is not going away. So the Russians are grinding forward, and they will continue throwing more men and more material at their pursuit of this objective, which leaves very little room for American leadership to play any decisive role, other than seek an off-ramp, which would be unfavorable to one of the parties. The Russians are not going to sign on to that deal, right? They have to be beaten on the battlefield. The question here is that will any American president, by the way, it's not something unique that I'm seeking here, beating in the battlefield. Every superpower with nuclear weapons has lost a war in the last 50 years. Every time they've invaded a country, they've been beaten back. So there is no reason why Russia can't be defeated on the battlefield. But the question here is, are you going to allow and are you going to invest in that particular action? The Americans and the Europeans are doing well in hosting conferences on Ukraine. They are not necessarily doing too much in helping the Ukrainians dominate the battlefield. Every time the Ukrainians seem to be doing better, there seems to be a new restraint imposed on them by either the folks in the European continent or from across the Atlantic. So I think the international dynamics in Ukraine are not necessarily going to be affected by who is in charge in the White House. I would argue the same is true of Gaza. And I think even there, internal politics in America is so divided, so divisive today, that you are not necessarily going to see an American position emerge that can change the course of what is happening in the Middle East decisively. You are still going to see a divided America approach that particular conflict, leading to very similar results. Look, any election outcome in America is going to be the victory for half of America. And it's very difficult to bring all of them onto the same boat when it comes to crucial issues which are far away. So, international dynamics, I think on China, they seem to have a consensus. I don't think they have necessarily been able to convince all their partners on the China threat. Carl is sitting here. I think the Europeans are gung-ho on China. They are doubling down. The Germans are investing more. They have increased their FDI into China. So I think whoever comes into the White House now is going to find that the world is a is a difficult place for American leadership, and American politics at home is going to make it even more complicated for them.
So, Doctor, since you mentioned that they have like a consensus regarding China, so are we expected the U.S.-China contest to be like to continue regardless who's the presidents, like in the United States? And my other question, how might the U.S.-China contest impact the regional dynamics in Asia, particularly in terms of security alliances and economic partnerships? Like, and how would these dynamics differ under Harris versus Trump?
So on the China question, I think they have a consensus. I think there's an American consensus on China, but I don't think there's a global consensus on China. I was telling someone recently that in the last 2 years or 2.5 years, that we have had in India, we've had 100,000. I think at the peak it was close to 200,000 troops, but there are still a very large number of troops facing off 5 meters apart on the icy heights of Himalayas. Even at that particular time, that period of 2.5 years when we were in this particular moment of near conflict, our trade grew by 7 to 8% each year. So in some sense, there is a growing realization around the world that for various nations' economic futures, China has become a vital and crucial actor. It's not because they offer deals that are more attractive. They are the only ones offering deals. The Europeans and Americans have counted themselves out of many of the sectors which are essential for the emerging and developing countries, where the only player in town are the Chinese. And now, of course, you have, in the last 5 or 7 years, you have other actors coming in. The Chinese are going to face competition in going into the future. But the Americans don't offer what the Chinese offer to the others. Now, unless the Americans come back into the business of infrastructure building and large projects that will shape the landscapes of coastal communities in different parts of the world, unless they build those bridges and ports and industrial complexes and highways and expressways, the Chinese are going to be continuing to be an essential foreign policy proposition for any country around the world. So yes, the Americans have a consensus, but the world does not. Even the Europeans don't agree with the American consensus. There is a division. Even within Europe, you would have a very differentiated appreciation of the China factor. So I think one of the challenges for the new president would be to get others to sign on to the China project, which, barring a few, and I would argue that It leads the Quad, the Japan, India, Australia quadrilateral that they have. Barring this quadrilateral, I'm not seeing too much support for America's China project, as it were. And even within the Quad, Japan's largest partner is China, Australia's largest partner is China, and India's either first or second largest partner is China. So, it's a very interesting, and US's own largest trading partner is China. So as we oppose China, we have amongst the Quad themselves a $1 trillion trading relationship with the Chinese. So it's a very interesting challenge for any American leadership. It's not an easy game.
Thank you, Dr. I will get back to you again, but I will move to Professor Mehran. Professor, can you give us an overview about what is expected, or what the expected trajectory of escalation in the Middle East for both candidates, based on their positions on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, for example?
Thank you. So what we saw under Biden, it was a very ideological approach to the Middle East. Biden comes from a generation and from a mindset which sees a very ideological role for the United States in the world, and in particular, he has an ideological commitment to America's relationship with Israel. And ironically, although Biden said he does not want forever wars, what we've seen is the kind of, we don't see an end in sight to the two wars that are going on, and two wars that started under his presidency. Unfortunately, I see Kamala Harris as Biden light. She may not necessarily have that ideological conviction, but the prevailing forces in the United States are such, political forces, the strength of lobby groups are such, that I think a fundamental shift in American policy towards Israel, or an end to the genocide in Gaza, is nowhere in sight. And we heard earlier very articulate explanation of the fact that neither candidate has offered a vision of post-war reconstruction. We heard earlier in the plenary session that 41,000 Palestinians have died. I think that's an important number to keep in mind. And that's up until today. Heaven knows what the number is going to be in the coming days. Now remember, this 41,000 people who have died have siblings. They have families. They have friends. These deaths are not going to be forgotten or forgiven by successive generations of Palestinians. And not only will the Palestinians remember these, but demagogues and ideologues across the region. And unfortunately, our region has had a lot of these. Ideologues and demagogues across the region, dictators who need international sources of legitimacy to compensate for their own lack of domestic legitimacy, will not forget these casualties and these tragedies. And so I think one of the things we're going to see, unfortunately for our region, we're not going to see a lack of tensions, lack of instability, because a lot of these forces that can put an end to the war. When the American president can pick up the phone and tell the Prime Minister of Israel, stop it, that political will is not there. And I'm afraid, as a result, our region will continue to have tensions. And of course, that's just the American side of it. The region itself is prone to tensions. I don't think we need to look to Washington to see that developments in Tehran, for example, do not necessarily bode well. We're in for a leadership transition in Iran with the supreme leader. Even supreme leaders have finite lives. And so I think what we're likely to see is continued instability, regardless of what happens in Washington.
Speaking about Iran, since you mentioned Iran, looking at the first term of Donald Trump presidency, we could notice that he used the maximum pressure policy against Iran. Okay, so if Donald Trump to be re-elected, could we see a return to this policy against towards Iran, or with the current situation in the Middle East, such as you mentioned, like the conflict in Gaza and Iran's involvement in it, along with the evolving interactions between Iran and some countries in the region, like for example the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Could these factors like limit Trump's ability to re-implement that policy towards Iran?
Of course, as you remember, in his first term, Donald Trump surrounded himself with a number of key policymakers, like his Secretary of State, his National Security Advisor, figures who were documented Iranophobes and took pride and were greatly responsible for maximum pressure and other kinds of policies. It turned out that the Iranians could withstand those pressures. But I think it's also important to remember that Donald Trump is an extremely transactional and publicity-seeking individual. He's not ideological, although he does spew out ideological dogma. But the guy wants publicity. He wants the big picture. Remember, he's the only American president who's walked on North Korean soil. He's the only American president since the Iranian Revolution who asked the Iranian foreign minister to go to the White House because he wanted a big deal. He wanted a publicity. So if the Iranians played smart, if the Iranians give him the publicity he wants, they can deflate or at least ameliorate some of that pressure and some of that bombastic rhetoric that Donald Trump is so famous for. I think that's something to keep in mind. Also important is the fact that there's been also an important shift in Tehran as well with the recent election. First and foremost, with the Raisi presidency, Iran embarked on this very important policy of good neighborly relations. And we saw in 2018, 2019, improvement between Iran and the UAE. In 2020, I believe, or 2023 rather, we saw improvements between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And now, of course, we have the architect of the nuclear deal as the Iranian foreign minister, and a president who has made it his mandate to improve relations with the West. Whether the European Union has the backbone to improve relations with Iran, and whether the Americans have the political will to start talking to the Iranians is a different story. But at least the political will on the Iranian side is there.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Saran, let's move to India in particular. Like, how will the outcome of the U.S. election influence India's role in the region, in the global system, let's say? And we have heard recently that there is a possible role of India to be a mediator between Russia and Ukraine, even though I haven't seen any official statement, but many argue that it has the possible the qualification to play that role. So how will the outcome of the US elections influence India's role?
Over the last 2 decades, and I think perhaps turn of the century, the last part of the Clinton term, where somehow he discovered some positive aspects of India and became a bit of an India, supporter. Very, very, very last part of his. But since then, we have seen, irrespective of who's been in the White House, that relationship has blossomed. So from George Bush to Obama, but for a brief moment again when Obama was thinking of dividing the world into the G2, but for his G2 moment of madness, we've seen all US presidents add to the relationship. And I would dare say that Biden has been the single most, perhaps, strongest advocate of this partnership, perhaps because he comes from the time when he actually was the loudest voice on India in the 90s. And when he became president, he remembered that unfinished business of his when he was wanting a stronger relationship. So he has done a lot for the India-US ties. The Trump administration did as well. So my point here is that I don't think the bilateral relationship's course is likely to change, irrespective of who enters the parliament. There are going to be different irritants, but the core of the relationship remains unchanged, irrespective of who comes. The Democrats like to harp on, democracy and society questions. By the way, they should be talking now only to themselves after what's happening in their country, and they should possibly be taking lessons on how to conduct democratic societies from India. But that's another point. So the Democrats are going to harp on that. Trump is going to obviously want the better deal for business and for industry and open up for some of their own, his favored industrial groups. They're going to be different irritants, but the direction is going to remain upwards, northwards, for the same reason, for that one important reason that, or rather the only issue on which America has a consensus, China. As long as China continues to be the largest threat and the biggest challenge for the United States of America, India is a vital part of America's global scheme. Now, at some point, if tomorrow there was some miracle was to happen and the India-China relationship was to change completely and was to transform into one which is hugely positive and hugely forward-looking, in some sense positive for both parties, you would certainly find a new layer of complications and complexities emerge in different relationships, including the one between India and US. But I don't see that happening. I think the emperor for life has ensured that while he lives, the relationship grows. So in some sense, that is likely to remain unchanged. On India's role as a mediator, well, I think it's more the news cycle that paints it as such. India has very little ambitions to be that mediator. Perhaps it should, and at some point it might, but I don't see it happening for at least a generation. You need to have certain political, institutional sinews, muscles, to be able to play that role of taking brickbats from your own publics and from your partners. If you play the role of a mediator, it's not easy, right? If you remember, Erdogan and Lula some years ago had decided to play mediator in the Middle East. I think Syria, if I'm forgetting which particular crisis it was, but they had raised their hands and said, Iraq. That was Iraq. So they had raised their hands and said, we'll go and play mediate. And you know what happened? That attempt to mediate lasted a few weeks when New York Times tore them apart, and they quickly retreated back to their own capitals. So I think being a mediator is far more complicated, as Shashi Tharoor would testify, having been in the United Nations, that it is a thankless job, and it's a job that is likely to attract more brickbats than any bouquets. And therefore, any country must certainly be a facilitator of conversations rather than be a mediator of solutions. The solutions have to be decided by the two parties. And by the simple virtue that Prime Minister Modi is the only global leader who within a span of a week or a month could hug both the leaders, it tells you that there is a facilitative role in which certain conversations could be seeded by the very fact that he talks to all of them. And by the way, the leader in UAE is also one such important global personality who could do the same, right? There are very few. There are a handful of such people who could reach both parties and have serious conversations. So I think facilitative role could be something that we should consider. Mediation, certainly not. And I think the India-US relationship is guaranteed by Xi Jinping.
So it's more related based on China than who's. Okay, I understand that. Let's move to Mr. Cooper again. Yes. How might a more collaborative and open approach from the US under the Harris presidency impact the resolution of global conflicts?
So I want to go back to a point that Dr. Tharoor raised during the plenary session on the relationships that the US is currently developing, has developed, tied to economic interest and security interest, countering or balancing China. And this goes back to these other regional collections, right? So the Quad has already been referenced here today. Regionally, and this was referenced in the plenary, the Abraham Accords. This is actually part of that. So that was initiated under the Trump administration, but the Biden administration initiated AUKUS. And if one looks at the Quad Abraham Accords, AUKUS, all of those, while they have their founding states in each of those agreements, there's opportunity for growth in each of those agreements. And they have some unique aspects and interoperability and interdependencies in each other. So there's mutual benefit. And why those are important is they help build economic and security resilience. And so that resilience could be either countering a shared threat. So the Abraham Accords, we mentioned Iran here already. There are still shared pernicious threats in the Gulf Cooperation Council when it comes to proxies. So while the regime may have been stating to seek cooperation, the prosecution through Hamas, the prosecution through the Houthis, that's a problem. That is a shared problem. So that's something that is being addressed collectively, say, through the Abraham Accords. But there's a myriad of economic opportunities and investment that is also happening through the Abraham Accords. So going back to the Indo-Pacific, AUKUS, though there's only 3 states in this trilateral entity, the intent on addressing reciprocities and interoperability is to expand that beyond Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. We've talked about some other states like that today. Japan would be a good example of that kind of expansion there. So there's certainly room when we look at how does this play. I would also offer that even though it's quite easy today across the world for politicians to go after globalization versus the anywheres and the somewheres that have been raised several times, is that the reality is we're more connected and more interdependent than we've ever been, ever. And that's not changing. Actually, globalization is a planning factor. And so while it is a issue of concern in certain parties, this is why from U.S. imperatives, there's a real effort across administrations to look at where there are mutual benefits and reciprocities. And that's why I wanted to really put emphasis on those 2 examples. Trump led with Abraham Accords, Biden led with AUKUS, but I'd see that's more of a pattern of the same than something that's different. I think that's, we will see globally more opportunities from regional reciprocities.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Let me go back to Professor Mehran. I have a question regarding the Iranian nuclear deal. Could Harris' presidency lead to a shift in U.S. policy regarding to the nuclear deal, or we could see like the same approach that was adopted by Biden administration? So,
thank you. That's a very good question, but a difficult one to answer because there's a lot of ifs. But I think the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was applied at a particular moment in history, in 2015, when there was this assumption that Iran would curtail its enrichment and would open up its nuclear facilities to inspection, more rigorous inspection, and in return for sanctions relief. And if you look at it from Tehran's perspective, they got the raw deal because the Iranians view that they lived up to the terms of the agreement. The U.S. unilaterally withdrew in 2018, and no sanctions relief was forthcoming. They got a few tiny propeller planes, and that was it. And those propeller planes had to kind of rush to Iran in order to avoid running afoul of American sanctions. So the new foreign minister, who was the architect of the nuclear deal, has said that the nuclear deal does not serve Iran anymore, and that if Iran is going to go back to the table and wants to negotiate, it wants a new deal. And the Americans and their allies also have new thoughts, because they figure, at least Donald Trump thinks he could have gotten a better deal, takes pride in having ripped the nuclear accord. And you remember that former National Security Advisor Bolton had a ripped up copy of the nuclear deal framed in his office. And so I don't think that going back to the nuclear deal as articulated in 2015 really obtains anymore. I don't think it makes sense. And I think, but I do think they need to, not for neither side, neither for the Americans nor for the Iranians. And I think they've made their situation clear. What I think is important is to see whether Kamala Harris has the political capital and the political will, particularly in the US Congress, to open up dialogue with Iran. The Iranians and the Supreme Leader has blessed that they want some sort of a dialogue, of course, in their own terms. But I'm not too optimistic, although I try to be. I don't see much room for optimism there.
But don't you think like they should involve again, given the fact that Iran is like playing a significant role in the stability or instability of the region? No. I mean, like you said, like Kamala Harris, you are not sure if she can like has the political capability like to like bring the nuclear deal again. But don't you think that it's very important right now, since we need to give something to Iran, given the fact that Iran has like a very increasing involvement and influence in the stability and instability of the region?
Absolutely. But the problem with that question is that it's logical. It makes logical sense. And we all know that politics, and particularly diplomacy, don't always abide or don't always play out logically. So you're absolutely right in that sense. I think also there's one thing that's key to remember. If you look from 1979 on, the Iranians have quote-unquote misbehaved insofar as the US and its allies are concerned whenever they've been under American pressure or they've been threatened. They haven't responded positively to threats. I think you'd be very hard-pressed to find episodes in which Iran has been threatened, has been under pressure, and has behaved in ways that the Americans have wanted it to behave. In fact, it's doubled down. It has lashed out. It has strengthened its ties with proxies. It has, and whenever it has been under maximum pressure, it has lashed back. But when there's been conditional engagement, the Iranians have responded positively. And I think that's key. That's a key area to watch, to see whether there will be some sort of kind of positive signals in response to the positive signals we've heard from Tehran since Pezeshkian's election. Are those signals going to be heard by somebody else in European capitals? We just saw last week that Iran Air was sanctioned from a number of European capitals. So I think, if we have to wait and see whether those signals coming out of Tehran will be met by positive signals from other capitals.
Yeah, sure.
I really, I think that I really want to emphasize the importance of Europe in this equation. And I think that's really important. And who sits in the White House is going to change the behavior of Europe. I think that's the biggest implications of what might happen in a Trump versus Harris White House. A Trump White House is perhaps going to be met in Europe with a different response this time around. I think if last time they were slightly meek at the beginning and found their voice only towards the end of the Trump presidency, this time the Europeans might be far more forthright from day one of the Trump presidency. You might have a transatlantic relationship that could implicate many, many issues. I mean, the Middle East is one of them, and Iran is certainly the most important one of them. But also industrial policy, climate change, China, you name it, technology. You could see the European regulators take on American tech companies in a slightly perhaps irrational way, stifle innovation to protect European interests. So I think one of the biggest international dynamics that we should watch out for is the transatlantic relationship that emerges post this election. That is the single most important relationship that is going to be implicated by how the election swings. All of us are going to, in our societies, we will make a relationship with whoever sits in the White House. For us, he's the, or she is the American president, and we will build that relationship. But the Europeans, the family members, the Atlantic family is going to be ruffled by what happens in the elections.
Thank you, my guest speakers. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time. I was assuming like we have more time, but we have like here Dr. Al-Badr Shatri. He's one of the commentators, discussant, and maybe Dr. Badr, if you have any comment or yes, very briefly, please.
I do have a lot, but I don't want to stand between people and the next panel. Yes. I'm not on the table.
Within 1 to 2 minutes. Please.
Okay. I'm not on the table. I hope I'm not on the menu, but I have something for you from my menu. First, let me make a distinction between woke and MAGA. The woke is more like a trend, a political trend or ideology within the United States. MAGA looks like more a movement that is more coherent and has a policy. How woke became a derogatory or pejorative term that the conservative hurl on anyone who disagrees with the conservative ideologies. Not all the conservatives, but the Trump-type conservatives. But actually woke meant that people were conscious or awakened. That's the etymology of the woke. Awakened to the racial inequality or gender inequality and so on and so forth. That's where the term came. Unfortunately, we didn't get any chance to discuss. Regarding the U.S. Commitment to agreements, and I agree with the speaker that mostly the United States keeps its commitment, but sometimes when it comes to agreements like the Paris, climate change, we saw Trump withdrew from that. President Reagan withdrew from the UNESCO. Before that, because of the orientation of the UNESCO, not only that, but also JCPOA, which was not ratified by, you are right, by the Senate, but the president also. START is another example where Reagan negotiated staff limitation, and then the Senate jumped on him, and he wasn't able to go through. So that's some of the problems that regarding another thing about international trade and Trump. One thing we should remember, and sorry to sound a little bit political sciencey. If you remember, there is an article by Stephen Krasner, an old article, who talks about hegemony and the structure of international trade. A declining hegemon usually will be against free trade. And this is maybe what we are witnessing in the case. But what is the problem that people don't point out to in the relationship between China and the United States? Is China's unwillingness to manage the world. This is the problem. And United States retrenching maybe under Trump, and then what will you have is an apolar system, world system, that there will be no polarity. Nobody will be able to provide the public goods in order to run the system. And that's what Joseph Nye calls the Kindleberger trap, where before the World War II, there was a clear hegemon, which was the United States, but was unwilling to run the world system. So this is maybe the greatest thing that we should fear than anything else, like the Philistine trap, where this trap, the other trap, is both countries will want to avoid a nuclear war between them. So the greatest danger, according to Joseph Nye, is having this Kindleberger. Did I use up all my 2 minutes?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Badr. Thank you. That was very insightful, actually. If anyone want to comment or we're gonna have one question only from the audience. I got like many questions here, and most of them actually were answered. So, one of them to Mr. Cooper, what's the best realistic outcome of the Ukraine war the U.S. is hoping for, and how this outcome can be achieved?
That's a wonderful question that I cannot answer in a national capacity, since I'm not in a ministerial position, but I can give some reflections as to what many Americans would like to see. That's very hard to generalize, considering how heterogeneous the United States really is. I'm sitting next to my Indian counterpart here. India is a very heterogeneous society when you look at it closely. And I emphasize the heterogeneous aspect of the U.S. is because it's not just politics, it's also the culture of that. So, from a general perspective, regardless if an American is really following closely what's happening on the war front, if they actually are paying attention to movements and are actually following current affairs, or if they just have a broad understanding that Russia has done an incursion into another state. And depending on if I'm talking to somebody at a dinner party in Washington, D.C., or if I'm out in the Shenandoah Valley, which is a very rural or colloquially shruggy kind of place, very, very country, you're going to get some different perspectives. But what every American is concerned about, and this is reflected by statements that have been made on the record by former President Trump and current Vice President Harris, goes back to the humanitarian crisis issue. That is a constant. That is interestingly crossing every political perspective, every ideological perspective, every religious, ethnic perspective in the United States is concerned about the humanitarian aspect. What's not agreed upon is how is that resolved? Historically, though, another general perspective is the idea, if you look back at the bipolar era, and most of us in this room are old enough to remember the US-Soviet Union bipolarity that existed, that has roots in US concerns about Russia as an actor overstepping its bounds and Moscow reaching into Europe. So that's another general concern. How that's reflected by some Americans varies in degrees. Some are hearkening back to this is Moscow trying to recapture a lost era, that they're trying to recapture the old Soviet Union era. Some see it as in that's a Europe problem, which is it's an older isolationist viewpoint in the U.S. that goes back to 1939. But I go back to, if you're president, former President Trump, or you're Vice President Harris, and you're talking in town halls about this size, they are constantly going to be hearing about the humanitarian aspect, which is similar to what they're hearing about the war in Gaza, which is why, no surprise, both candidates are focused in that aspect. But what they do need to do, and this is where it gets really difficult for those of us who are in sub-ministerial positions when either of them are president, is the actual planning for post-conflict. So in Ukraine, the challenge is going to be, how does a European state become whole again and no longer at risk of invasion from Russia? How does Gaza repair itself to actually being a prosperous place where people want to have a full life and as a neighbor amongst neighbors? Those are challenges that are being worked out, and I would offer this one last takeaway. The career civil servants, the career foreign service officers, and the career military men and women are the ones who are doing the implementation on all of this, regardless of who the president's going to be in 2025. And those same men and women are also on the planning side of this. So to say that it's not been articulated in the campaign does not mean plans are being constructed, but they're being constructed by technocrats who will then deliver options to either a President Trump or President Harris, and those options that are being constructed by technocrats will be then decided by one of them. But yes, the concern, the average American concern in both those fronts is at the humanitarian scale, and that's why you're hearing that on the campaign trail.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. I have 1 minute for each speaker, for any final thoughts or intakes you would like.
So my quick response, and I think thank you for your intervention, and I think that is precisely true. Irrespective of who wins in the White House, there's a great likelihood that because of the divisions within the country, America is going to be less likely to be as imposing or as interested in world affairs in the next 4 years than it was in the previous 4. I think there is a steady decline of American investments into global peace, security, economic integration, etc., and that trend is likely to continue. I don't think it is going to disappear, and therefore the whole idea of building these small alliances, plurilateral networks, is what the American strategy is going to continue to be, to bring others in, to offset its own declining capabilities, capacities, but most importantly, political interest in managing global affairs. It is going to rely on a cluster of partnerships. This region is going to see significant American investments in those kind of partnerships that will help tide the future. So, irrespective of who comes in the White House, they are going to be coming to Asia soon.
A couple of decades ago, a book came out with the title Heroic Diplomacy about the Arab-Israeli conflict. And that heroic diplomacy led to the Oslo Accords. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that heroic diplomacy. And we've seen more of the same with maximum pressure campaigns of one sort or another. I think it's time we think outside of the box. I don't think, quite frankly, a two-state solution works. Gaza has been destroyed and rendered uninhabitable. I think we need to be realistic. Anyone who has traveled inside Palestine knows that Palestine is like a Swiss cheese state. The president of Palestine is the mayor of a couple of cities, probably, cities that cannot communicate with one another. So when it comes to Israel and Palestine, we need to rethink our frame of reference. We need to rethink our frame of reference about these alliances that work together in order to contain others, whether it's United States, Australia, United Kingdom, plus Japan. I think we need to think about, rethink our frame of reference about means of integration and communication. And I think diplomacy, in the way we've come to understand it over the last 2-3 decades, simply hasn't worked. And we need to kind of sit back and rethink some of these assumptions that have been guiding us.
Are you saying like the two-state solution doesn't work, or the approach is not working?
Two-state solution is impossible. I think we need to be realistic. I think we need, if you look at, two-state solution is psychologically comfortable. Diplomats love talking about it because it's something that, it's two-state solution. Bleeding heart liberals love it because it gives the Palestinians something to aspire for. But it's impossible. Go to Palestine, look at a map, look at the conditions on the ground. Two-state solution doesn't work. And as long as we keep talking about this window, small, brief window of opportunity we had in 1995 to make something happen, and both sides squandered it for their own reasons, the Palestinians and the Israelis, that doesn't apply anymore. And I think we need to rethink the way we approach that subject. And as long as we haven't solved that incurable problem, so far incurable problem, we're not going to see a reduction of meaningful tensions in the Middle East.
Thank you, Professor. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time for more questions, so we would like to take some more questions, but due to the time limitations, we have almost reached to the end of our conversation today. And before we conclude, I would like to thank you once again, our speakers, the Honourable R. Clarke Cooper and Dr. Samir Saran and Professor Mehran, for offering your very insightful and perspectives on the events that are taking place, like the US elections particularly. And we also thank you, our esteemed audience, for your participations, and we look forward to welcome you all again to our next discussions. Thank you.